When this old man saw a dog tied to a tree in the forest, he was left speechless. Who could be so cruel as to abandon a puppy in a place as scary as the woods? But then he noticed the letter pinned to its collar, and when he read it, he couldn't help but cry. Bruno had lived in his village his entire life and liked to believe that he knew everything that happened within its borders. That is why he couldn't believe his eyes. In front of him, right in the middle of the forest behind his house, was a horrible sight. A dog was tied to a tree. How could anyone from his beloved village do this to a helpless animal? He didn't know anyone who could be this heartless. The townspeople had actually been extremely sweet and helpful to him when he had lost his wife a few years earlier. He had met her in the village, and they had spent their whole life there. Now that he lived all alone in his cabin by the woods, someone still came to say hello from time to time, just to make sure he was still all right. They were good people and animal lovers. He had been able to rely on them when he'd also lost his beloved dog a few months earlier. They knew how lonely he was feeling and helped him cope with his loneliness. Bruno and his wife were never blessed with children, which meant the village kids had become their children. His late wife would make blankets for every new baby that was born and helped babysit for any mother that needed some rest. Bruno also enjoyed interacting with the kids, and after his wife died, he continued doing so. He always had candy in his pocket to give them when he was out and about in the village. Bruno was also observant. When he saw a family that was struggling, he also made sure to have a coin or two to place in the child's hand. The village was like a family, and that was why what happened that day shocked the man so badly. He had gone out to milk his goats that morning when he heard a heartbreaking cry. He walked outside of his fence to the forest behind his house. In just steps from his home, he had stumbled on that shocking sight. Bruno approached the dog with caution, but then noticed something even stranger about it. There was a strange letter tied to the dog's collar. When he opened it, he realized it had been written by the dog's old owner. But he didn't have his glasses on, so he decided to free the dog first and go back home to retrieve them later. He rubbed the puppy's neck and untied her, hoping she wouldn't bolt, but the dog was shaking with fear and didn't even try to take a step away. She wasn't far from the cabin, but that was the only home out there. She must have heard many scary noises while she was alone in the forest. He picked the dog up and took her to the cabin, where he gave her food and water. Then, he grabbed the letter that was still pinned to her collar. As soon as Bruno started reading, his eyes filled with tears. The handwriting was childish and shaky, as if whoever had written it had struggled to hold the pen. The letter read, "Uncle Bruno, I know you are a good man who looks after his animals. I love my dog Sandy very much, but I am worried that she will get hurt at home with us. When my dad has one of his early morning headaches, we know we have to be quiet. But Sandy is just a puppy. She doesn't understand, and sometimes she barks. Dad gets angry. It is sad, but I want Sandy to be safe. I am sorry that I am just leaving her behind your cabin for you to find. My mom and I don't want you to think we are bad people or that Dad is bad. Please don't try to figure out who we are, and please take good care of Sandy. I'm going to miss her very much." Bruno had to wipe his eyes after reading that letter. He couldn't believe the massive sacrifice a child had to make to ensure this animal was safe. He vowed to himself that he would prove worthy of the child's trust. Besides, it wasn't hard to fall in love with Sandy the dog. She was timid and scared. Whatever she had experienced in her first home had left her scared of loud noises, but she was also nervous to be left alone and would timidly follow him from room to room. Bruno had a solution to that. He would just take her everywhere he went. Sandy was welcomed into every shop in the village because the townspeople loved her owner and were happy to see him with a dog again. Bruno quickly trained her, and as she grew, she became more confident. When people asked where he had found such a handsome puppy, he always just told them he was gifted her by a friend. In his heart, he believed that it was true. He had been lonely before, and now the dog had filled a big spot in his heart. But with her came a whole lot of unexpected company too. The pup loved children, and all the village children loved playing with her. It was another reason they started to come to Bruno's cabin after school. There were a few kids in the village who had a hard time at home, as there were many poor people among them who couldn't afford the basics. To help them, Bruno had sandwiches ready for anyone who dropped by and needed something to eat. When the news that the old man in the woods was feeding everyone who came to his cabin hungry, more and more children started appearing on his threshold every day. Despite the dent they were putting on his finances, Bruno was happy to be surrounded by chaos. It was also great for Sandy to have children to run and play with. She loved playing with them, but she loved Bruno more than anyone. And she wasn't the only one. Most of the kids came and went, but one of the boys, Levi, was there often and quickly became attached to the old man. As soon as he was old enough, Levi started working odd jobs all around the village. He worked in the grocery store over the weekends and also helped people with their gardens. When it became clear that the old man couldn't do everything on the farm anymore, Levi showed up to help. He came each morning to milk the goats on Bruno's farm. The boy also fixed things that were broken and stepped in when there was anything that Bruno needed to help with. Bruno had done a lot for him and many other children, so at first, Levi just showed up ready to help. He didn't want to take money from the old man, and when Bruno had his pay ready after the first week, he refused to take it. But Bruno wouldn't accept that. He knew the boy needed money, but he also knew he had to be careful. He was a proud young man and hated that Bruno knew about his empty pockets. So the old man told the boy that his pride would only allow him to take the help if he could pay for it. He pretended that Levi was doing him a favor and secretly rejoiced when the boy had no choice but to agree. Someone else loved having extra company on the farm too. Sandy would follow Levi all over when he worked. It was fun to have someone young who could throw the ball between all those tasks, and she really liked his vigorous head scratches. Cutting trees around his house to keep it safe from forest fires or repairing the barn had become too tiring for Bruno. But with Levi's help, his land looked better than ever, and his house was safe enough for him to still live by himself. Time moved on, and suddenly, Levi was no longer a boy. He was a young man and was starting to think of his future. He knew that he had no way to pay for college, but he still dreamed of going to school one day. In the meantime, he would keep his head down and work hard. One day, Levi was working his shift at the grocery store when something really weird happened. Sandy came running into the store, jumping and barking. He thought that she had just run ahead of Bruno, but the dog was troubled, and the old man was nowhere to be seen. Levi tried to scratch her head, but she wouldn't allow it. She kept barking at him and pulling his pants towards the door. She had never acted like this before. Levi kept waiting, but Bruno didn't join her. That was when he realized that something was horribly wrong. He told the manager about his suspicions, and she told him to go. As quick as he could, he rode to the farm on his bike. As soon as Sandy realized he was going to follow her back home, she ran as fast as her legs would allow her. Levi had experienced a lot of things in his young life, but the fear he had on that ride would stay with him for years after. He pedaled with all his might, but the road to the cabin took forever. At last he made it and began searching for Bruno, but he was nowhere in sight. Levi searched all around the cabin, but there was no sign of the old man. Then he had an idea. He asked Sandy to show him where Bruno was, and she quickly ran into the forest. His heart beating loudly, Levi followed her. They hadn't run too far when he heard a soft moan. Sandy ran through some bushes, and on the other side, Levi found Bruno as well. When he saw the old man, he had to swallow hard. Was he even alive? His skin looked gray. It looked like he had stepped into a hole made by some animal. His leg was badly broken, and a bone was sticking out of a terrible wound. His foot was turning blue. Levi had enough experience of domestic accidents to know that he had to straighten the leg as soon as possible. He got closer and jumped when Bruno moaned. At least he knew that his old friend was still alive. Levi searched for a straight stick and used his own shirt to make a splint for the leg. However, before he could set it, he had to straighten the leg. He was happy that Bruno was unconscious because this was going to be really painful. Even in his condition, Bruno cried out in pain. Sandy could see he needed comfort, and she went to his face and licked him softly. She was also moaning and crying, scared that the person she loved most was in trouble. If she hadn't gone to find help, it would have been hours before anyone found Bruno. It would very likely have been too late. But Levi couldn't think of that at the moment. He had to focus on getting Bruno to the hospital. He tried to see if there were any other injuries that he needed to consider, but saw nothing. However, the nearest hospital was more than an hour away. An ambulance would take too long to reach them. He phoned them anyway and promised to meet them halfway. The only problem was that he had to figure out how to get him there. As gently as he could, Levi picked Bruno up. The old man was waking up and trying to explain that he had gone out to search for a goat that was missing. He sounded weaker than Levi had ever heard him, and as he was carrying him, the old man felt frail. He had always been so strong, and seeing him like this broke Levi's heart. He couldn't imagine his life without this man who had changed his life. Step after step, he carried Bruno to his vehicle. The old man had taught him to drive when he was a teenager, but it had been a long time since he last drove a vehicle. His father for sure never allowed him to drive his car, and his mother never had a car license. He gently laid Bruno on the back seat and made to climb in, but Sandy was moaning at the door, pawing at it to get his attention. She wanted to go with them. There wasn't a lot of time, but Levi let her jump over to the passenger seat, and then he carefully started driving. The experience was nerve-wracking. He knew he had to get the old man to the ambulance as quickly as he could, but with each bump in the road, Bruno cried out in pain. Seeing him like this was heartbreaking and scary. Levi was at the point of becoming an adult, but in those moments, he felt like a small boy. Bruno's breathing became uneven and shallow, and Levi knew that he needed help as quickly as possible. He almost cried when he saw the lights of the ambulance coming towards them from a distance. He flashed his lights and waved his arms out of the window and stopped on the side of the road. The paramedics pulled Bruno out of the vehicle and took him to the ambulance. They left Levi and Sandy there on the side of the road and sped away, telling them they would soon call with updates. Not knowing what else to do in the meantime, Levi drove home with Sandy and went to search for the lost goat. Later, he phoned the hospital. They told him that Bruno had survived the surgery to his leg, but had a long recovery ahead of him. When he recovered in the hospital, Levi moved into the cabin with him. While Bruno healed, he took care of the farm and Sandy. Thankfully, the old man was a fighter, and soon enough he started to get better. His leg was healing up, and finally, he could come home. Levi went to get him with Bruno's car. This was an old man who had no family, or so he thought. But when he got home, most of the village was there to welcome him back. He had done so much for them over the years, and they all loved him. He was a lot less alone than he ever believed. But more than anyone else, Levi had become his family. He stayed to help Bruno while he was recovering, and took care of him every step of the way. At first, Bruno didn't want him to, but the boy told him that it was his turn to help him. And one day, Levi told him something he had always suspected. He said that once there was a young boy who needed help saving his dog and his dignity, and Bruno had helped him. Now, it was that little boy's turn to help him. When he understood that Levi was the child who had entrusted him with Sandy, Bruno felt his heart break. The old man never had a son, but somewhere along the line, this young man had become his child. Levi did have a father, but he was horrible. It was Bruno who had taught him to become a good man. After Bruno had healed up, Levi still stayed with him and Sandy until it was time for him to go to college. It turned out he could attend school after all, because Bruno had created a college fund for him many years ago. In between classes, though, he would always come back to the cabin, the one place he thought of as home. Eventually, Levi took over all the farm chores. He didn't know it yet, but he would one day inherit the farm. And when Bruno passed away of old age, he did it with a smile on his face, knowing that Levi and Sandy would keep each other company and thrive. What a sweet story! Would you have the strength to abandon your pet if you were afraid for its safety at home? Do you know someone like Bruno? Tell us in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Join us again for even more incredible stories that can inspire you.